Let's remember that um, the day our countries gained independence, quote unquote independence, or the flag independence, the bureaucracy of governance didn't actually change. So the colonial bureaucratic system was not a democratic system, right? It was a top-down dictatorship hierarchy, right? And the day we gained independence, we replaced the colonial administrative staff with our national staff, right? With patriots, right? But the structure remained the same. Economically, we continued to dig the same colonial mines using the same colonial roads and railroads, shipping to the same colonial ports, shipping to the same final destination, right? And this is the logistics of colonialism remained, the bureaucracy of colonialism remained. The flag changed, right? And we have a national anthem and a national football team and all of that, and that is to be celebrated. That's the effort of our grandparents' generation. They did their part, and it's to be celebrated. Now the rest of the job is on us. Our generation is to decolonize those economic structures, and that's what we failed to achieve on this continent over the last 50 plus years, 70 years almost, depending on the country. And it's not that we didn't try. Several tried and lost their lives for it, right? So we have, our generation today has to learn from the generation in between that attempted and failed and attempted and lost their lives. So that means we need to be strategic and learn from our mistakes. So, for example, I'll just pick agriculture because you mentioned the industrialized world knows exactly what they want, and they do. In 1955, as this continent was very slowly gaining independence, one country at a time, the former colonial powers, in Europe in particular, recognized that they have a problem. They have a food security problem because they were so dependent on the colonies, right? So they met in Rome in 1955 as they were negotiating the Treaty of Rome, which is the foundational block of the European Union today. And they did say, we have a food problem. How are we going to regain our food sovereignty once we lose the colonies? And they use the term sovereignty, not security. In 1962, this led to the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP for short, which is in place to this day, a basic economic pillar of the European Union. And that is a system of heavy agricultural subsidies to support European agriculture to produce wheat, to produce maize, to produce the core crops for actual food security for their people. And it wasn't just Europe that did this, of course. The US, Canada, Australia, Japan, all the major economic blocs, including the former Soviet Union, by the way, which is why Russia and the Ukraine dominate the grain industry globally today. All of them, and they have every right to invest in their own agriculture, of course, and their own sovereignty. But what it did to our continent in particular is that our farmers who would normally be able to produce maize, who would normally be able to produce wheat and barley and all the food security crops for our people, they couldn't compete with the heavily subsidized crops coming from Europe in particular. So they were forced to switch to producing alternative crops for exports. And that is cash crops, more coffee, more tea, more tobacco, more bananas, all of those complementary food items. And that is what we mean when we say we produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. And this concept that was introduced at the time was called food security. And that is the most dangerous post colonial concept that we use to this day. And it's dangerous for reasons I'll explain, but it's also problematic because we on this continent use the term food sovereignty and food security interchangeably as if it's the same thing, because we don't recognize that food security is a technical term. It's not a colloquial term. Of course, in the colloquial sense of the term, who doesn't like food security? I like food security. But it's a post colonial term that literally means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people. either by producing the food yourself, which we don't do anymore or as much. Number two, by importing the food from abroad, which we do increasingly. Number three, by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which gets us into debt traps. And number four, which is worse, is by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers because they can't compete with free food. So that's food security for you. And it produces hunger, it produces food dependency. And to close this example, I urge all of your listeners to go online and look up the name of the French Ministry of Agriculture. It's available online. It's called the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. And browse a little bit some of the speeches, for example, of the French Minister of Agriculture over the last few years, especially after the Ukraine conflict that caused some food, price disruptions and shortages. The French Minister of Agriculture was touring the French media, radio and TV stations, almost constantly for a period of about a month to reassure the French public not to worry about this temporary disruption. Why? Because he said, we, the Europeans, have invested in our food sovereignty since 1962. This is just a temporary disruption. Don't worry. And then he says, immediately switches the code, right? He says, I want you to worry about our African friends who don't have food security. So food sovereignty for Europe, food security for Africa. So they know exactly what they mean. The problem is that we in Africa, the general public, but especially our ministers of agriculture, our presidents and prime ministers, they need to know what we're dealing with so that when we're negotiating for climate, for debt, for development, for agriculture, for trade, we know not to keep falling again and again and again in this post-colonial trap.
It's,
And that is just
that is,
agriculture.
yeah,